For every woman who survived a man who mistook her silence for weakness. For every child born between two worlds and claimed by both. The rain over Seoul that night was the kind that felt personal. It did not simply fall. It drove itself sideways through the city's glass canyons, rattled penthouse windows on the 43rd floor of the Han River Tower, and pressed against the world like judgment. Like something old and patient had finally arrived to collect what was owed. Inside the penthouse, the only light came from the city below, thousands of neon signs bleeding red and gold against the wet sky, beautiful and indifferent. The living room was all sharp lines and imported stone. Nothing in it was soft. Nothing in it breathed. Aisha Okon stood with her back against the floor-to-ceiling window, one hand pressed flat to the glass, the other cradling the enormous weight of her belly. 8 months. 8 months of carrying a life inside her while the man she had married carried nothing but suspicion in his chest. Kim Tae-woo stood 6 feet away. He had not moved in 3 minutes. He simply watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes, the eyes that had once made her feel seen, and now made her feel like something pinned under glass. His shirt was still perfectly pressed despite the late hour. He had not touched his whiskey. That was how she knew it was serious. Tae-woo only left his glass untouched when he was preparing to do something terrible. "Say it again," he said softly. Softly was worse than shouting. She had learned that. "I have said it every day, for 6 months. Aisha's voice was steady. She had practiced steady. She had held steady through things that would have collapsed other women, and she would hold it now. "This child is yours." Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of something almost human, doubt, pain, something that might have been grief if he had allowed it to grow. But Tae-woo was a man who pruned weakness from himself the way a surgeon removes disease. The flicker died. "I had a vasectomy." 3 words. Flat and final, as though they ended the conversation before it began. "And the doctor told you what the reversal rate is."
"We talked about this."
"You showed me the report." "I showed you nothing." His voice cracked then, and the controlled precision of it shattered for one raw second before he caught it again. He crossed the room in 4 long strides, and Aisha did not step back. She had decided long ago that she would not step back from him. Not once more. He stopped close enough that she could see the vein pulsing at his temple. His jaw worked. His hands, those careful, precise, dangerous hands, balled at his sides. "That bastard inside you," he said, his voice dropping to a sound barely above a whisper. "It belongs to that Itaewon dog, doesn't it? The Nigerian businessman your godmother introduced you to. I have photographs, Aisha. I have. You have lies." Her chin lifted. "Whoever gave you photographs gave you fiction. I have never been unfaithful to you. Not once. Not even when you gave me every reason to leave." His hand came up. And then it came down. The sound of it was swallowed by the rain. Aisha's head snapped sideways. She pressed her palm against the sting on her cheek, and she felt the baby move, a sharp, indignant kick, as though the child already understood what kind of world it was being born into. She turned back to face him slowly. Her eyes were bright, but not with tears. They were bright with something else entirely. Something she had been building in the dark of this penthouse for months, brick by quiet brick. "Kill me if you want, Tae-woo." Her voice was almost gentle. "But this baby is already more Korean than you will ever be human." The words landed.
She saw them land.
Something in his face went very still, the particular stillness of a man who has been struck somewhere he didn't know he could be reached. Then he stepped back, reached for his whiskey, and said nothing. The rain continued its judgment outside. Neither of them had planned any of this. Or rather, one of them had planned none of it, and the other had not planned enough. 3 years ago, Aisha Okon had arrived in Seoul with a suitcase, a portfolio of design sketches, and the particular brand of stubborn optimism that Lagos installs in its daughters, like a second skeleton. She had secured a small studio in Itaewon, that beautiful, chaotic, internationally flavored district that sat like a warm island in Seoul's cooler geography. Itaewon smelled of jollof rice and bulgogi, of incense and soju, of 100 different countries deciding to exist in the same block. She had found work quickly. Her hands were extraordinary. She could look at a bolt of Ankara fabric and see not what it was, but what it wanted to become. Her small studio became a word-of-mouth sensation among Seoul's African community and then among the curious, design-forward Koreans who wandered through Itaewon looking for something they couldn't name in other districts. She was 26. She was good. She was happy in the uncomplicated way of someone who has found work that matches the shape of their soul. Then one February evening, when the cold had turned the city to iron, a man fell through her studio door. He was bleeding from his left side, a wound that had been poorly bandaged and had long since soaked through. His suit was worth more than her monthly rent. His face was the color of chalk beneath its natural warmth, and his eyes, when they found hers, were calculating even through the pain. He did not beg. He simply said, in perfectly measured English, "I require medical attention, and I require your silence." Most people would have called an ambulance. Most people would have called the police. Aisha had grown up in Lagos. She recognized a man in trouble that hospitals couldn't solve, and she recognized that the trouble that came for such men sometimes came looking for witnesses afterward. She sent her assistant home. She locked the door. She cleaned and resutured the wound with the medical kit she kept in her studio. She had grown up helping her grandmother with the women in their neighborhood, and her hands had learned steadiness early. She never asked his name. He sat in her cutting chair and watched her work with the focus of a man cataloging information. She could feel his eyes mapping her hands, her face, the way she worked without drama, without fear of the blood. When she was done, he stood carefully and straight in his ruined jacket with a habit of control so deep it functioned through physical pain.
"Thank you," he said.
"Go home," she replied, returning to her cutting table. He left. She spent the rest of the evening designing a wedding hanbok in Ankara print for a Nigerian-Korean couple, and she put the bleeding man firmly out of her mind. He was not, it turned out, so easily put away. Kim Tae-woo was 34 years old and had not been surprised by anything in a decade. He was the head of the Black Lotus, a Kangpai organization that had operated in Seoul's shadow economy for 40 years, built by his father, inherited by him at 26 when his father died of a stroke and his older brother died of a rival's bullet on the same week. He had taken over the organization with methodical brutality, restructured it into something leaner and more dangerous, and expanded its influence into Busan, Incheon, and eventually through legitimate business fronts that made the organization's money invisible. He had enemies. He had subordinates. He did not have friends, and he had learned to regard this as a form of efficiency. He had also been told, following a vasectomy at 30, that heirs were a liability. Heirs gave enemies leverage. Heirs were weakness wearing a human face. He had written the possibility of fatherhood out of his future with the same calm deliberateness with which he wrote off bad investments, and he had never revisited the decision. What he had not expected, the first unexpected thing in 10 years, was a Nigerian woman in Itaewon who cleaned his blood off her hands and told him to go home, and who occupied his thoughts for 3 months afterward with the persistence of something lodged deep in the chest. He had her investigated, of course. He investigated everyone. He learned her name, her history, the structure of her small business, the neighborhood she grew up in Lagos, the grandmother who had raised her, the godmother, Mom Ngozi, who had come to Seoul with the first wave of Nigerian traders 15 years ago and built herself an unofficial authority in the African community. He learned that Aisha owed nothing to anyone, feared very little, and was, by every account available, exactly what she appeared to be. This, in Tae-woo's experience, was the most extraordinary thing a person could be. He returned to her studio 6 weeks after she had stitched him closed. He came without bleeding this time, though some of the people who had caused the first wound were no longer able to cause problems for anyone. He came with a bottle of wine she had mentioned offhand to her assistant, and he stood in the doorway of her studio and said simply, "I owe you a debt." Aisha looked up from her work. "You don't," she said. "I didn't do it for a debt." "I know," he said. "That is why I'm here." It was not romantic. It was not easy. She was suspicious of him. She was Lagos-born, and Lagos girls learned to read men the way others learned to read weather. She knew he was dangerous. She knew his wealth had a darkness in its origin that he wore as comfortably as his suits. She did not pretend not to know. But she also knew this. He was honest with her in a way that might have been strategic and might have been something rare. He told her what he was. He did not apologize for it. He told her what he wanted, her company, her conversation, eventually her hand, and he laid the terms clearly, without decoration. "I will not be safe for you," he said, 6 months after they had begun seeing each other in the careful, watchful way of two people who recognized they were doing something irreversible. "My world is not safe. People who are close to me become targets. Then why ask me to stay?"
He was quiet for a long time.
Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Because I have not been surprised by anything in 10 years, he said finally, "and I find I am not ready to go back to that." She married him in a private ceremony attended by his lawyer, her godmother Maman Ngozi, and no one else. The syndicate was not told. The elite families who had expected him to marry within their circles were not consulted. He put her in his penthouse and surrounded her with security and presented her to his world as a fact. Not a question, not an apology. A fact. The syndicate hated it. A black woman from Nigeria. A seamstress from Idiwan. The whispers in the organization ran like water under ice, cold and persistent. But no one challenged Kim Tae-woo to his face, because no one who challenged Tae-woo to his face remained in a position to do so a second time. His lieutenant, Choi Min-jun, smiled and said nothing. He simply filed the information away and waited for the right moment, with the patience of a man who has learned that all things eventually crack under sufficient pressure. The right moment arrived when Aisha announced she was pregnant. Tae-woo's face, when she told him, went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: shock, calculation, and then a particular blankness that she recognized as the setting of a trap. For 3 days he said nothing. He watched her. He made calls she couldn't hear. He came to bed late and lay with his back to her with the rigid stillness of a man performing sleep. On the 4th day, he came home to find Min-jun waiting in the living room with a tablet displaying a series of photographs. Aisha at a restaurant in Idiwan with an older Nigerian man who Min-jun identified smoothly as a businessman with well-documented connections to her community, a man she had known casually for years, had greeted at community events, had sat across from at a lunch organized by Maman Ngozi for the African Business Association. The photographs showed them laughing, touching glasses, leaning close, the way people lean when a restaurant is loud. They showed nothing else because there was nothing else to show. But Min-jun was not interested in showing everything. He was interested in showing enough. "She's been seen with him regularly, boss," Min-jun said, his voice careful with manufactured reluctance, as though he hated delivering this information. "The timing of the pregnancy." "Leave," Tae-woo said.
Min-jun left.
He did not look at Aisha as he passed her in the doorway. He did not need to. From that day, the world of the penthouse contracted around her. Her phone calls were monitored. She could see it in the way conversations ended seconds after she began them, in the new faces among the security detail who watched her with a different quality of attention than before. The building's ground floor became inaccessible without a 2-hour notice given to the head of security. Her shopping was delivered. Her studio visits, the small slice of autonomous life she had maintained through the marriage, were cancelled under the explanation of security concerns.
She was not beaten.
Not yet. The cruelty was of a more architectural kind at first, the removal of space, of air, of movement. The replacement of every small freedom with an identical-looking substitute that was slightly wrong in some essential way, like a door painted to look open but built into a solid wall. Then the words began. Tae-woo, in the early hours of morning, standing over her with whiskey on his breath, asking her in Korean to confess, demanding in English that she look at him and tell him the truth, dissecting her past, her friendships, her community events, the restaurant photographs, with the careful fury of a man who has decided the verdict and is simply building the case after the fact. And then the night with the rain, and the slap, and the words she had chosen like weapons. "This baby is already more Korean than you will ever be human." Aisha lay awake that night with her hand on her belly and listened to Tae-woo's footsteps move through the penthouse below. Back and forth. Back and forth. A caged thing, though he didn't know he was the one in the cage. She thought about Maman Ngozi, about the small, folded notes she had started passing out through the woman who delivered her traditional Nigerian food twice a week, the only outside contact Tae-woo had allowed because rejecting it would have required him to justify why, and justification was a thing he avoided. The notes contained information, details.
Names.
Account numbers she had memorized from documents she had found when she was still allowed to move freely through the penthouse. She thought about the hidden phone, the second one, the small, prepaid thing she had taped to the underside of a drawer in the dressing room. The one she had used to record his words. Not all of them. Enough of them. She pressed her palm against the movement of her child and thought, wait, not yet. Survive first. Then rise. The rain kept falling. The baby came in March, when the plum blossoms were beginning outside the penthouse windows, small, stubborn, pink things pushing up through the cold with the absolute confidence of something that has decided to exist. Aisha had been in labor for 11 hours by the time Taewoo would allow anyone to help. He had refused the hospital from the first sign of contractions, too public, too many records, too many people who might ask questions. He had summoned instead a man whom he called a doctor, and who had the hands and eyes of someone who had done things for the syndicate that licensed medicine did not cover. Aisha had looked at the man and understood exactly what he was, and she had said nothing because she was beyond the phase of protesting and inside the phase of surviving. She held on to the window frame during contractions. She breathed through them with the focused efficiency of a woman who had grown up watching her grandmother birth babies on a plastic sheet in a Lagos apartment. She did not scream, which frustrated Taewoo in some ways she could see but not name, as though her silence was itself a form of defiance. Minjun stood by the door to the living room with his hands folded and his face professionally neutral, monitoring everything. He had been the one to suggest the back alley physician. He had been the one to frame it as caution. He watched Aisha labor and said nothing and waited. When the child finally arrived, screaming and already furious with the world, the room went briefly silent. The doctor cleaned the baby and held him up, and Taewoo stepped forward and stopped. The child had his mother's rich brown skin, warm, deep, luminous. He had her full mouth, and he had his father's eyes, sharp, slightly upturned at the outer corners, long-lashed, already watchful. He had, impossibly, perfectly, both of them written on his face at once, a living argument against everything Taewoo had convinced himself was true. For a single moment, and she saw it, she had always been able to see the things he tried to hide. Taewoo's face broke open. A crack in the stone, something that looked like wonder, and grief, and the terrifying possibility of love. Then Minjun spoke quietly from the doorway. "Boss, the color of the child." And the stone closed again. "This is not my blood." Taewoo's voice was someone else's, hollow and small inside its attempt at certainty. "Look at him. He has your eyes." Aisha's voice, from the bed, was barely above a whisper. She was bleeding heavily, and she knew it. The doctor was working behind the sheet, and his hands were moving with an urgency that Aisha chose not to examine too closely. "Look at his eyes." But Taewoo was not looking at the eyes. He was looking at the skin, at the curls already forming at the crown of the baby's head, at the story he had written in his own mind playing itself out before him in the shape of this child, and he lunged. The doctor moved faster than a man his age had a right to move. He turned his body between Taewoo and the child and said something low and firm in Korean that even Aisha, who had been learning the language for 3 years, could not fully parse. It was enough. Taewoo stopped. He stood with his fist raised and his chest heaving and his eyes bright and terrible, and then he turned and walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Aisha, bleeding, exhausted, teetering on the dark edge of consciousness, found her voice one more time. "His name," she said, "is Kwame." She chose the name deliberately. A Ghanaian name, a Pan-African name, a name that said you cannot shrink my child into your fear. A name that would make Taewoo's teeth ache every time he said it. "Kwame Okonkim," she said, and closed her eyes. Minjun watched from the doorway with the faint, private satisfaction of a man whose plan was unfolding precisely on schedule. He did not know, no one knew yet, that the doctor he had sourced was a man who kept his loyalty for sale to the highest current bidder, and that Mom Ngozi had found him first, 6 weeks ago, and had paid for a specific service to be rendered if and when the time came. The doctor finished his work, packed his bag, and paused at the door. "The child is healthy," he said to no one in particular. "I will send the health documentation by morning." He did not mention the small vial he had already secured. He did not mention the number he would dial from his car in the parking garage below. The DNA test results would arrive in Kim Tae-woo's private inbox in 72 hours. Min-jun's campaign had been elegant in its construction and devastating in its execution. He had served Kim Tae-woo for 9 years. He had been at his left shoulder in 18 confrontations, 3 territorial wars, and 1 near assassination attempt from which he had personally dragged the Don to safety while bleeding from his own arm. He had been the most loyal lieutenant in the Black Lotus, and he had spent 9 years watching that loyalty go unrewarded in the way that mattered to him most, the chair. Tae-woo had no plans to step back. Tae-woo had no heir, by design, which meant he also had no plans for succession, which meant Min-jun's path to the chair was blocked as long as Tae-woo breathed. When Aisha appeared, and then the pregnancy, Min-jun had understood with the clarity of a man who studies power. This child, if legitimized, would be groomed for the seat that should have been his. An heir changed everything. And so he had moved carefully. A photograph here. A whispered suggestion there. He had cultivated Tae-woo's existing paranoia about weakness, the vasectomy, the iron rule against heirs, until it became a blade that he simply needed to aim. He had not expected Aisha to be as strong as she was. He had not expected the doctor to be bought. And he had not expected, nobody ever expected this about her, that the woman who had been locked in a penthouse for 6 months had been running. The email arrived at 3:47 in the morning. Tae-woo was in his study, a room that Aisha had not been allowed to enter since the photographs, drinking slowly and going over ledgers he wasn't actually reading. He looked at his phone when it vibrated, a reflex, and opened the message from a clinical lab address he didn't recognize. He almost deleted it. Something made him read instead. Results: paternity analysis, Kim Tae-woo/Kim Kwame Okon. He read the percentage twice, then a third time. Then he set the phone down on the desk and sat very still for a very long time while the city outside continued its indifferent, glittering life. 99.999%. The vasectomy reversal rate, spontaneous, natural, occurring in roughly 2% of cases over a decade, was a documented medical phenomenon that his urologist had mentioned in passing at a follow-up appointment 2 years after the procedure. Tae-woo had dismissed it as irrelevant. He had been certain. He was always certain. Certainty was a discipline he practiced. He picked up his whiskey glass and threw it at the far wall. The sound of it shattering was not satisfying. He picked up the lamp. He left the lamp. He stood up and walked to the window and looked at the Han River below, black and wide and indifferent. The child was his. The child was his, and he had nearly. He did not finish the thought. He was not a man who permitted himself the full weight of what he almost did. He converted it immediately, as he converted all pain, into something actionable, something with a target. He called Min-jun at 4 in the morning. Min-jun arrived within 20 minutes, still buttoning his jacket, his face professionally arranged into an expression of concerned readiness. He had been awake, of course. He had been monitoring Tae-woo's inbox the way he monitored everything. He had been waiting for the call. "Sit down," Tae-woo said.
Min-jun said.
Tae-woo placed the phone on the desk between them, the email visible.
Min-jun looked at.
He said nothing. A good performance. Tae-woo would grant him that much, in retrospect. The man held his face very still. "You fed me lies," Tae-woo said. His voice was the quiet of the open sea before a storm. "The photographs. The suggestion about timing. You built a case against my wife from nothing, and you brought it to me and he stopped. You wanted me to destroy my own heir." Min-jun opened his mouth. The gun was already in Tae-woo's hand. Afterward, when the body had been removed and the floor had been cleaned with the efficiency of a household that had handled such things before, Tae-woo went to the room where Aisha lay recovering with the baby. She was awake. She was always awake when he came. He understood now that she had never truly slept in this penthouse. She had been watchful from the first night. He looked at the child in the bassinet beside her. Looked, genuinely, for the first time, and saw what she had been trying to show him. The eyes. His mother's eyes were dark and warm and Lagos. His father's eyes were sharp and cool and soul. This child had both, layered into something new, something that didn't belong to either city, but claimed them both. He looked at Aisha. She looked back at him. Her face was still, not cold, controlled. There was a difference, and he understood it because he had lived in that difference himself. "The test proves he is mine," he said. He had rehearsed several versions of this conversation. This was the most direct. "I was wrong. Minjun. Minjun is no longer a concern. You will forgive me, and we will raise the child as the heir of Black Lotus. He will have every protection, every resource. You will want for nothing." He waited for relief, for gratitude, for the soft collapse of a woman who has been offered rescue. Aisha looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then slowly she smiled. A small, warm smile that did not reach the place behind her eyes where the real Aisha lived. "Of course, husband," she said. "Whatever you say." Taewoo nodded, satisfied, and left the room. He did not notice that her right hand, hidden beneath the blanket, was wrapped around a small prepaid phone. He did not notice that the smile stayed on her face for exactly as long as it took for his footsteps to fade down the corridor. Then it dissolved into something quiet and purposeful, and she began composing a message to Mama Ngozi. "It's time. Start moving the pieces. All of them." Kwame was 5 months old when Taewoo decided to present him to the syndicate. In those 5 months, the penthouse had become something different and something the same. Taewoo was present in a way he had not been before. He came home earlier, sat with the child in ways that were stiff and uncertain, and gradually, almost against his will, became less so. He watched Kwame with the focused intensity he usually reserved for threats, as though the child was a problem he was working to solve. Then, one morning, Kwame curled a tiny fist around Taewoo's finger and made a sound of satisfaction, and Taewoo sat with that small hand holding him for 40 minutes without moving, without speaking, with an expression on his face that Aisha had never seen on it before and would not have known how to name. She watched all of this. She catalogued it without sentimentality. She had loved this man, once, genuinely, clearly, with the open-eyed love of someone who knew what she was loving and chose it anyway. That love was not dead. It had simply been put somewhere safe, away from the part of her that was doing what needed to be done. She had spent 5 months continuing what she'd started. She had access now to more of the penthouse, to the common rooms, to Taewoo's study when he was not home. She used it carefully, taking photographs with the hidden phone, memorizing account numbers, noting names from correspondence. She was not performing recovery for an audience of one. She had genuinely recovered from the birth, and the strength she walked with was real, and the intelligence she applied to the project of dismantling Kim Tae-woo's empire was the same intelligence she had always applied to design, patient, architectural, and concerned above all with structure. Mama Ngozi's network moved with the efficiency of women who had been building infrastructure quietly for decades, because that is what immigrant communities do in cities that don't officially acknowledge them. They build systems. They build trust. They build networks of mutual obligation and protection that function beneath the radar of the official world and are therefore undetectable to men who only know how to use official channels. Passports were arranged. A bank account in a name Taewoo didn't know existed. Evidence, the recordings, the financial documentation, a careful compilation of everything she had gathered, was distributed across 3 encrypted drives, each in the hands of a different person in a different country, with instructions about when and how it should be delivered. She contacted a journalist, a Korean-American woman who had been investigating Kangpai financing for 2 years. Aisha did not speak to her directly. Mama Ngozi brokered the introduction, but she contributed a document package that the journalist described later as the most comprehensive financial exposure of an organized crime organization she had ever seen. She contacted the National Police Agency through an anonymous channel, and she made one more call, a man she had met once, briefly, at a trade meeting her studio had attended before her marriage. A man who operated in the unofficial spaces between the Korean Kangpai and the Chinese criminal networks that moved money through the same financial corridors. A man who had very specific reasons of his own to want the Black Lotus's financial ledgers to become public. All of this was done in the 5 months, during which she smiled at Taewoo over the dinner table and watched him learn, slowly and reluctantly, to love his son. The heir ceremony was held in a grand private venue in Gangnam, All dark wood and traditional details, low lighting, the long low tables of a formal Korean celebration arranged in the Black Lotus configuration that signaled every rank and division within the organization. The men arrived in their expensive subtlety, fine suits, no flash, the uniform of power that doesn't need to announce itself. Taewoo stood at the head of the room with Kwame in his arms, and for a moment he was simply a father holding his child. That strange, unguarded thing that Aisha had been watching appear in him in pieces. He held the boy up before his assembled organization, and his voice was steady and proud. "This is my blood, my heir.
Kamem Okonokim.
Swear your loyalty." The men began to kneel. Every phone in the room vibrated simultaneously. The video played on every screen. Taewoo had always been meticulous about digital security within his organization, but he had never considered the possibility that the attack would come from inside the penthouse. From the one person his security detail was instructed to monitor for outgoing threats, not to consider as a source of them. The footage was clear. Aisha, on her knees in the penthouse, her belly enormous, and Taewoo's voice, unmistakable, precise, in Korean and English, detailing crimes over the phone in the assumption that the room was empty. It was not the only footage. There were 6 clips in total, spanning 8 months, each containing enough material for prosecution many times over. While the video played, Ngozi's network released the financial documentation to the National Police Agency, to the journalist, whose story went live on the wire simultaneously, and to the specific Chinese network contacts Aisha had identified. The rival organizations had been waiting. They moved immediately on the Black Lotus territories in Busan and Incheon. The room erupted. Aisha, who had been seated quietly near the far wall with Kwame in her arms, Taewoo had wanted her present, had wanted to display the completeness of his household, stood up in the chaos and walked with steady, unhurried steps to a service corridor where a young man from Ngozi's network was waiting with a car key and a baby carrier and a single, practical bag. She strapped Kwame against her chest. She followed the young man to the service elevator. She descended to the basement. She got into the car. She heard, faintly, from somewhere above, Taewoo's voice tearing through the noise of his collapsing world, calling her name. She drove toward the airport. She did not look back. Seoul burned in his wake. Or rather, and this was more accurate, more honest to what happened, Seoul revealed itself as a city that had been waiting for the Black Lotus to fall, and the fall happened with the speed and completeness of something whose structural failure had been building long before the final crack. Businesses that had operated under syndicate protection found themselves exposed. Men who had sworn loyalty to the Dawn discovered very quickly that their loyalty had been to power, not to person, and power had just changed address. Taewoo ran. He had safe houses. Of course he did. He had resources that Aisha's evidence hadn't been able to locate. He had allies whose loyalty was deeper than Minjun's had been, men who had reasons of their own to keep him breathing. He went underground with the efficiency of a man who had always known this was a possibility and had always maintained the infrastructure for it. He spent the first month in Busan, in a waterfront apartment belonging to a retired associate, watching the news cycle consume everything he had built. He spent the second month in Jeju, growing a beard he hated and reconsidering everyone he had ever trusted. He spent the third month beginning to look. He was good at finding people. He had resources for it. He had contacts who moved in the networks that Interpol monitored but couldn't dismantle. It took him 8 months to find her. He had looked in London. Aisha had once mentioned wanting to study there. He had looked in Abidjan, in Accra, in Paris. He had fed everything he knew about her into every network available to him. She was not hiding in the end. She was simply somewhere he hadn't thought to look, because it was a place he had always categorized as a step backward rather than a destination. She was in Lagos. The city received him like a body, rejecting a foreign object. Taewoo had never been to Nigeria. He had done business with Nigerians. Black Lotus had moved money through Lagos financial networks for years, but he had always done it through intermediaries. The city existed for him as a set of data points: population, GDP, port infrastructure, corruption indices. Lagos was not a set of data points. Lagos was a living, breathing argument against the idea that order was the natural state of things, and that argument made itself in 12 languages at once, and at a volume that suggested it had never once considered the possibility of losing. He arrived without his suits, without his security detail, with cash in a plain backpack and a photograph of his son. He made his way through Oshodi and Ikeja and eventually to the quieter residential streets on the outskirts of the city where, he had been told, a compound existed that had been recently renovated, where a business operated out of the ground floor and a family lived above it, and where a 2-year-old boy had been heard speaking a language that the neighbors couldn't quite place, something that sounded like Korean mixed with Yoruba, like a song from two directions at once. He stood outside the compound gate in the late afternoon. The air smelled of red earth and bougainvillea, and something frying. Children's laughter somewhere above the walls. A woman's voice, rich and warm, saying something in Yoruba that he couldn't understand. Then a child's voice, responding in the same language, and then switching, with the liquid ease of a mind that hasn't yet learned that languages are supposed to be separate, into a string of Korean syllables that rearranged something in Taewoo's chest. The gate opened. Kwame came through it at a run, chasing a ball, and stopped dead when he saw the stranger. He was 2 years old and already had his father's stillness, that quality of absolute watchfulness that most people had to learn and the Kim men appeared to carry from birth. He looked at Taewoo with his layered eyes, his mother's and his father's at once, and said nothing. Then he turned and ran back through the gate.
Mana, strange man. Dive waited.
Aisha came to the gate in a wrapper of deep indigo ankara and a white blouse, her hair in a low twist. She looked different. Not older, not harder, more settled. The kind of settled that comes not from stillness but from having run as far as you needed to run and arrived somewhere you recognized. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the gate fully and stepped back, and that small gesture, the gate opening, nearly undid him, because it was grace he hadn't earned and he knew it. He came inside. The compound was warm and chaotic in the Lagos way. Mom Ngozi was there, sitting at a table under the mango tree with 3 other women Taewoo didn't know, and they looked at him with the collective, evaluating gaze of women who have survived men and know how to read them. A young woman who worked in the fashion studio came out with a tray of drinks and placed it on the table without looking at Taewoo directly. A sewing machine was running somewhere inside. The ground floor of the compound was filled with fabric, rolls of ankara, bolts of silk, the gorgeous structural framework of Aisha's work arranged on racks alongside pieces he recognized from photographs, hanbok silhouettes in African print, chimijiagari reimagined in Kent and Shweshwe, a formal style that was neither Korean nor African, but was fluently both. Kwame had retreated to the far end of the courtyard, where he had resumed his ball game with 3 neighborhood children. He did not look at his father. He cast one quick, sidelong glance, a glance that was entirely Taewoo's own glance, returned to him from the face of his son, and then returned to the game, with the diplomacy of a child who has learned not to make decisions for the adults in his life. Aisha sat at the table and did not offer him a seat. He took one anyway, which she had known he would. "You took 8 months to find me," she said. "You weren't hiding."
No.
She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't hiding. I was building." He looked around the compound. The studio, the women, the life that had assembled itself here with the purposeful abundance of something that had found its right conditions. He thought about the penthouse, its clean lines, its controlled light, its expensive silence. "He has grown," Taewoo said, and his voice did something on the words that he hadn't planned for. Aisha looked at Kwame. The child was narrating the ball game to his friends in a stream of Yoruba Korean that neither language fully owned. She smiled, a real one, nothing weaponized in it. "He is extraordinary," she said simply. "He is mine." The words came out without the aggression he'd have attached to them a year ago. Just a statement, a fact he was still learning to hold. "He is his own," Aisha said, turning back to Taewoo. "He belongs to himself first, then to me, then to both worlds he was born from. He will never belong to Black Lotus. That world is finished, Taewoo." He was quiet. A market vendor was calling something down the street outside the compound walls. A generator hummed. The sewing machine inside continued its patient work. "I destroyed everything I built," he said. "You are the instrument," she said. "I made the decisions." He looked at her. She held his gaze without apology.
"What I did to you," he said.
A sentence that didn't complete itself because he was not built for the language it required. "Yes," she said. "What you did to me." They sat with that for a moment. Mom Ngozi, at the far table, said something to her companions in Yoruba that made them laugh. Quiet, knowing laughter that acknowledged the situation without interfering in it. Taewoo looked at his son across the courtyard. Kwame, feeling the attention, looked back. They regarded each other with identical gravity. Then Kwame picked up his ball and walked, with great deliberateness, across the courtyard. He stopped in front of his father, who went very still. The boy said in Korean, "Are you my appa?" Taewoo's throat moved. "Yes," he said. One word, scraped clean of everything that usually accompanied his words. Kwame considered this information with the philosophical thoroughness of a 2-year-old. Then he held out the ball. Taewoo took it. He held it in both hands. Kwame pointed, imperiously, toward the open space of the courtyard. "Kick," said Kwame in English. Then, in Yoruba, "Luyu." Taewoo looked at the ball. He looked at his son. He looked at Aisha, who was watching him with an expression that gave away nothing and somehow gave away everything. He stood up. He set the ball on the ground. He kicked it, clumsily, because he had never played this way in his life, and Kwame erupted in laughter, a sound so bright and uncomplicated that it rang off the compound walls and startled the birds from the mango tree. Aisha watched her son laugh. She watched her son's father chase him across the courtyard with the ball, equally ridiculous and equally, inexplicably real. She did not soften. She did not revise what he had done to her. She did not do him the injustice of pretending it hadn't happened. But she allowed the moment to be what it was, complicated, imperfect, and alive in the way only true things are alive. Mama Ngozi appeared at her shoulder and placed a cup of tea beside her without a word. He stayed in Lagos for 3 days. There was no dramatic scene.
No begging.
No final reckoning with a gun or a courtroom or the traditional architecture of revenge. The real ending was quieter than the story deserved, which is usually the way of real endings. He slept in a guest room in the compound. He ate jollof rice and looked vaguely surprised that he liked it. He played with Kwame in the courtyard each morning for approximately 45 minutes, which was the amount of time Kwame would tolerate before his attention moved to something else. He watched Aisha work, the way she moved through her studio, the way her staff looked at her, the way she had built, in the red soil of Lagos, something that was entirely hers. On the morning of the 3rd day, he found her in the studio before sunrise, working on a commission, a bridal hanbok in oso oak fabric for a Korean-Nigerian couple getting married in Abuja. He watched her work from the doorway for a long time. "You should have been given more," he said finally. "I took what I needed," she said, without looking up. He was quiet. Then, "Will he know me?" She set down her shears. She turned and looked at him, really looked the way she had always been able to look at him, past the architecture of control and into whatever was actually there. "That depends on whether you become someone worth knowing," she said. Not unkindly, as a statement of terms. He nodded. One short, precise nod. He left the compound that morning before Kwame woke up. He left a number that was clean, untraceable to the syndicate, untraceable to the old life. He left a letter for Kwame, handwritten in Korean. He left a bank transfer that was large and, more importantly, legitimate from money he had kept separate, clean, invested in legal entities that had never touched the Black Lotus. Aisha did not read the letter. That was for Kwame, when Kwame was old enough to choose whether he wanted to read it. She took the money and put it in a trust in her son's name. She went back to her studio. The sewing machine ran. Kwame Okunkim grew up knowing both worlds. He grew up eating suya and tteokbokki. He grew up with Mama Ngozi's Yoruba proverbs and the Korean language tapes his mother played at night, so he wouldn't lose his father's tongue. He grew up in Lagos and later in Seoul, when the city opened itself to him at 17 in the form of a design scholarship, one that Aisha had quietly funded through the fashion brand she had built into something formidable, something that sat at the intersection of African and Korean aesthetics and was celebrated in both Paris and Lagos and Busan. He grew up knowing what his mother had survived. She told him, carefully, age-appropriately, and then completely when he was old enough for completeness. She did not frame it as a story of victimhood. It would not have been honest to do so, and she was above all things honest with her son. She told it as a story of design. A problem with impossible constraints, and the solution she had engineered under pressure. He grew up meeting his father twice a year, then once a month, then at irregular intervals determined by geography and schedule and the slow, careful rebuilding of a relationship that had no blueprint and proceeded accordingly. Taewoo was not the father Kwame would have designed if given the choice. He was stiff and formal and sometimes said the wrong thing, and occasionally defaulted to control when he was uncertain. But he came. He kept coming. He learned to play football properly, eventually, because Kwame insisted. He learned to tie a gully badly and laughed at himself, which was the most human Kwame ever saw him. He was a bridge Kwame. Not because anyone required him to be, he would have resented the requirement, but because that was the shape he grew into naturally, the shape of someone who had Korean eyes and a Lagos laugh and a mother who had made something beautiful from every broken thing handed to her. He stood, at 23, in a gallery in Seoul where his first independent collection was on display. The pieces were extraordinary, not because they combined two aesthetics, which was easy and everyone tried it, but because they didn't combine. They argued. Each piece contained a tension that was the tension of his own life. The Korean precision and the Nigerian abundance, the structure and the color, the cold and the warmth, not resolved into harmony, but held in productive, beautiful opposition. Aisha stood in the gallery in a dress from her own label, handbox structured, anchor printed, both things completely. She stood with Maman Ngozi, who was 72 and had dressed for the occasion in something regal. Taewoo stood on the other side of the room, in a dark suit, watching his son talk to journalists with his mother's ease and his father's precision. He looked like a man who had been given something back that he hadn't deserved to have, and knew it, and was trying to be worthy of it anyway. Aisha caught his eye across the gallery. She held the look for a moment. Then she turned back to Maman Ngozi, who was saying something in Yoruba that made her laugh. Kwame, from the other side of the room, saw them both. He took the measure of the distance between them, the same distance that had always been there, that would probably always be there. That was the honest geography of what had happened. He did not try to close it. He simply moved through the gallery, talking to everyone, belonging completely to himself. The son of two worlds, the heir to none of them, something new and entirely his own. And toba ezi, omze azizi. Whoever does good, their child will see good. Aisha Okon said this proverb to herself on the night she walked out of the Black Lotus Air ceremony with her son strapped to her chest and Seoul's lights blurring past the car window. She said it like a vow, like a covenant with the universe. The universe, for once, kept its end. She built her brand into a name that appeared in the conversation about global fashion in the same breath as names that had a century's head start. She built it on the same principle that had kept her alive in a penthouse that was a beautiful cage. Patience. Structure. The understanding that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to make you small is to keep growing. She never remarried. She was asked several times by men who recognized what she was, and the recognition was never quite the thing they thought it was, because what she was could not be simplified into the thing they were looking for. She was not looking. She was building. She was not the woman who had walked into that immigration office to extend a work permit, desperate and overdrawn and 3% away from being entirely disconnected from help. She was also, in all the ways that mattered, exactly that woman, the one who had decided, in the middle of a cold Korean winter, that one problem at a time was enough. Just fix the visa. Just survive. Just breathe, Amara. Just breathe. She breathed. She rose. The Han River kept flowing through Seoul, black and wide, and indifferent to the stories played out on its banks. Blood ran into it, and tears, and the ordinary effluent of a city that contained multitudes. The river processed all of it with the patience of water that has been doing this long before the city arrived, and will continue long after. In Lagos, a boy who spoke 3 languages and could sew a seam that would outlast the garment drew pictures with red crayons and wore both his names with equal ease and thought about the world he would build when he was old enough to build it. In Seoul, a man who had been the most feared person in a room for 20 years learned, late and imperfectly, that fear was not the same as power, that the things he had tried to control had never been his to control. Somewhere between those two cities, in the space between Korean and Yoruba, between the cold and the warmth, between what had been done and what had been made from it, a story continued. Not finished. Not even close to finished. Just begun.